The essays and lectures of Henri Bergson from 1903 to 1923 were collected in this volume in English called The Creative Mind, An Introduction to Metaphysics. The French is La pensée et le mouvement, which means thought and movement. I'm going to be reading these essays and lectures as an exercise for myself, but also so that if you have been meaning to read them and just haven't gotten around to it, you can just listen to these audio recordings. They are translated by Mabel L. Anderson, published by Dover Publications. Preface. This collection comprises, first of all, 2 introductory essays written especially for it, and consequently heretofore unpublished. They make up a third of the volume. The rest are articles or lectures, mostly out of print, which appeared in France or in other countries. Taken as a whole, they date from the period between 1903 and 1923. They bear mainly upon the method I believe should be recommended to the philosopher. To go back to the origin of this method, to trace the direction it impresses upon research, is the particular object of the 2 essays which make up the introduction. In a book which appeared in 1919 under the title L'énergie spirituelle, I collected some essays and lectures dealing with the results of some of my work. The present collection, in which are grouped essays and lectures, is a sequel to the first, relating this time to the task of research. The delegates of the Clarendon Press of Oxford have very kindly authorized the reprinting in this volume of the 2 lectures, so carefully edited by them, which I gave in 1911 at Oxford University. I extend to them my cordial thanks. H.B. Introduction, Chapter 1, Growth of Truth, Retrograde Movement of the True. What philosophy has lacked most of all is precision. Philosophical systems are not cut to the measure of the reality in which we live. They are too wide for reality. Examine any one of them, chosen as you see fit, and you will see that it could apply equally well to a world in which neither plants nor animals have existence, only men, and in which men would quite possibly do without eating and drinking, where they would neither sleep nor dream, nor let their minds wander, where, born decrepit, they would end as babes in arms, where energy would return up the slope of its dispersion, and where everything might just as easily go backwards and be upside down. The fact is that a self-contained, vrai, system is an assemblage of conceptions so abstract and consequently so vast that it might contain, aside from the real, all that is possible and even impossible. The only explanation we should accept as satisfactory is one which fits tightly to its object with no space between them, no crevice in which any other explanation might equally well be lodged, one which fits the object only and to which alone the object lends itself. Scientific explanation can be of such a kind. It involves absolute precision and complete or mounting evidence. Can one say as much for philosophical theories? There was one doctrine, however, which seemed to me as a youth to be an exception, and that is probably why I was drawn to it. The philosophy of Spencer aimed at taking the impression of things and modeling itself on the facts in every detail. To be sure, it still sought its basis in vague generalities, and I was quite conscious of the weak points in his first principles. But these weaknesses seemed to me to be due to the author's insufficient preparation and his inability to grasp the significance of the latest ideas of mechanics. I should have liked to take up this part of his work, complete it and consolidate it, and I set to work on this task to the best of my ability. That was what led me to consider the idea of time, and there a surprise awaited me. I was indeed very much struck to see how real time, which plays the leading part in any philosophy of evolution, eludes mathematical treatment. Its essence being to flow, not one of its parts is still there when another part comes along. Superposition of one part on another with measurement in view is therefore impossible, unimaginable, inconceivable. There is no doubt but that an element of convention enters into any measurement, and it is seldom that 2 magnitudes, considered equal, are directly superposable one upon the other. Even then, this superposition must be possible for one of their aspects or effects which preserves something of them. This effect, this aspect then, is what we measure. But in the case of time, the idea of superposition would imply absurdity, for any effect of duration, which will be superposable upon itself and consequently measurable, will have as its essence non-duration. Ever since my university days, I had been aware that duration is measured by the trajectory of a body in motion and that mathematical time is a line. But I had not yet observed that this operation contrasts radically with all other processes of measurement, for it is not carried out on an aspect or an effect representative of what one wishes to measure, but on something which excludes it. The line one measures is immobile. Time is mobility. The line is made, it is complete. Time is what is happening. And more than that, it is what causes everything to happen. The measuring of time never deals with duration as duration. What is counted is only a certain number of extremities of intervals, or moments, in short, virtual halts in time. To state that an incident will occur at the end of a certain time t is simply to say that one will have counted from now until then a number t of simultaneities of a certain kind. In between these simultaneities, anything you like may happen. Time could be enormously and even infinitely accelerated. Nothing would be changed for the mathematician, for the physicist, or for the astronomer. And yet the difference with regard to consciousness would be profound. I am speaking naturally of a consciousness which would not be integrated with intracerebral movement. The wait from one day to another, from 1 hour to the next, would no longer cause it the same fatigue. Science cannot concern itself with this specific wait, or interval, and its exterior cause. Even when it is dealing with time which is passing or which will pass, it treats it as though it had passed. This is, in fact, quite natural. The role of science is to foresee. It extracts and retains from the material world that which can be repeated and calculated, and consequently that which is not in a state of flow. Thus it does nothing but lean in the direction of common sense, which is a beginning of science. Usually when we speak of time, we think of the measurement of duration, and not of duration itself. But this duration which science eliminates, and which is so difficult to conceive and express, is what one feels and lives. Suppose we try to find out what it is. How would it appear to a consciousness which desired only to see it without measuring it, which would then grasp it without stopping it, which, in short, would take itself as object, and which, spectator and actor alike, at once spontaneous and reflective, would bring ever closer together, to the point where they would coincide, the attention which is fixed and the time which passes? Such was the question, and through it I delved deep into the domain of the inner life, which until then had held no interest for me. I very quickly spotted the inadequacy of the associationist conception of the mind. This conception, then common to most psychologists and philosophers, was the result of an artificial regrouping of conscious life. What would direct vision give? Immediate vision, with no interposed prejudices. A long series of reflections and analyses made me brush aside one prejudice after another, and abandon many ideas I had accepted without question. Finally, I believed I had found pure, unadulterated inner continuity, duration. Continuity which was neither unity nor multiplicity, and which did not fit into any of our categories of thought. That positive science had not been concerned with this duration was, I thought, quite natural. Its function, after all, is to compose a world for us in which we can, for the convenience of action, ignore the effects of time. But how had Spencer's philosophy, a doctrine of evolution constructed to follow reality in its mobility, its progress, its inner maturing, been able to close its eyes to what is change itself? This question was later to lead me to tackle once again the problem of the evolution of life, taking real time into account. I was to find then that Spencerian evolutionism had to be almost completely recast. For the moment, I was absorbed by the vision of duration. In reviewing the different systems, I noticed that philosophers had paid almost no attention to it. All through the history of philosophy, time and space have been placed on the same level and treated as things of a kind. The procedure has been to study space, to determine its nature and function, and then to apply to time the conclusions thus reached. the theories of space and time thus become counterparts of one another. To pass from one to the other one had only to change a single word. Juxtaposition was replaced by succession. Real duration was systematically avoided. Why? Science has its own reasons for avoiding it, but metaphysics, which preceded science, was already doing so without having the same excuses. As I examined the various doctrines, it struck me that language was largely responsible for this confusion. Duration is always expressed in terms of extension. The terms which designate time are borrowed from the language of space. When we evoke time, it is space which answers our call. Metaphysics must have conformed to the habits of language, which in turn are governed by the habits of common sense. But if science and common sense are in agreement on this point, if the intelligence, either spontaneous or reflective, rules out real time, might it not be because the goal of our understanding demands it? That is what I thought I observed in studying the structure of the human understanding. It seemed to me that one of its functions was precisely to mask duration, either in movement or in change. If it is a question of movement, all the intelligence retains is a series of positions. First one point reached, then another, then still another. But should something happen between these points, immediately the understanding intercalates new positions, and so on indefinitely. It refuses to consider transition. If we insist, it so manages that mobility, pushed back into more and more narrow intervals as the number of considered positions increases, recedes, withdraws, and finally disappears into the infinitely small. This is perfectly natural if the intellect is destined, first of all, to prepare and bear upon our action on things. Our action exerts itself conveniently only on fixed points. Fixity is therefore what our intelligence seeks. It asks itself where the mobile is to be found, where it will be, where it will pass. Even if it takes note of the moment of passing, even if it seems then to be concerned with duration, it restricts itself in that direction to verifying the simultaneity of two virtual halts, the halt of the mobility it is considering, and the halt of another mobile whose course is presumed to be that of time. But it is always with immobilities, real or possible, that it seeks to deal. Suppose we skip this intellectual representation of movement, which shows it as a series of positions. Let us go directly to movement and examine it without any interposed concept. We shall find it simple and all of a piece. Let us go further. Suppose we get it to coincide with one of those incontestably real and absolute movements which we ourselves produce. This time we have mobility in its essence, and we feel that it mingles with an effort whose duration is an indivisible continuity. But as a certain space will have been crossed, our intelligence, which seeks fixity everywhere, assumes after the event that movement has been exactly fitted onto this space, as though it, movement, could coincide with immobility, and that the mobile exists in turn in each of the points of the line it is moving along. At most, we can say that it would have been at one of these particular points if it had stopped sooner, if, in view of a shorter movement, we had made an entirely different effort. It is only a step from there to seeing in movement just a series of positions. The duration of movement will then break up into moments corresponding to each of the positions. But the moments of time and the positions of the mobile are only snapshots which our understanding is taken of the continuity of movement and duration. In these juxtaposed views, one has a practical substitute for time and movement which conforms to the exigencies of language until such time as language lends itself to the exigencies of computation. But one has only an artificial means of recomposing. Time and movement are something else. Endnote 1. What the cinematograph shows us in movement on the screen is the series of immobile views of the film. It is, of course, understood that what is projected on the screen, over and above these immobile views themselves, is the movement within the projector. Return to the text. We shall say as much for change. The understanding breaks it up into successive and distinct states supposed to be invariable. If one looks a little more closely at each of these states, noticing that it varies, asking how it could endure if it did not change, the understanding hastens to replace it by a series of shorter states, which in their turn break up if necessary, and so forth ad infinitum. But how can we help seeing that the essence of duration is to flow, and that the fixed placed side by side with the fixed will never constitute anything which has duration? It is not the states, simple snapshots we have taken once again along the course of change, that are real. On the contrary, it is flux, the continuity of transition. It is change itself that is real. This change is indivisible. It is even substantial. If our intelligence insists on judging it to be insubstantial, to give it some vague kind of support, it is because it has replaced this change by a series of adjacent states. But this multiplicity is artificial, as is also the unity one endows it with. What we have here is merely an uninterrupted thrust of change, of a change always adhering to itself in a duration which extends indefinitely. The text breaks here into the next section. These reflections engendered many doubts as well as great hopes in my mind. I told myself that metaphysical problems had perhaps been badly propounded, but that precisely for that reason it was no longer advisable to believe them eternal, that is, insoluble. Metaphysics dates from the day when Zeno of Elea pointed out the inherent contradictions of movement and change as our intellect represents them. To surmount these difficulties raised by the intellectual representation of movement and change, to get around them by an increasingly subtle intellectual labor, required the principal effort of ancient and modern philosophers. It is thus that metaphysics was led to seek the reality of things above time, beyond what moves and what changes, and consequently outside what our senses and consciousness perceive. As a result, it could be nothing but a more or less artificial arrangement of concepts, a hypothetical construction. It claimed to go beyond experience. What it did in reality was merely to take a full and mobile experience, lending itself to a probing, ever deepening, and as a result, pregnant with revelations, and to substitute for it a fixed extract, desiccated and empty, a system of abstract general ideas drawn from that very experience, or rather from its most superficial strata. One might as well discourse on the subject of the cocoon from which the butterfly is to emerge, and claim that the fluttering, changing, living butterfly finds its raison d'être and fulfillment in the immutability of its shell. On the contrary, let us unfasten the cocoon, awaken the chrysalis. Let us restore to movement its mobility, to change its fluidity, to time its duration. Who knows but what the great insoluble problems will remain attached to the outer shell? They were not concerned with either movement or change or time, but solely with the conceptual cocoon which we mistakenly took for them or for their equivalent. Metaphysics will then become experience itself, and duration will be revealed as it really is, unceasing creation, the uninterrupted upsurge of novelty. For that is what our habitual representation of movement and change hinders us from seeing. If movement is a series of positions, and change a series of states, time is made up of distinct parts immediately adjacent to one another. No doubt we still say that they follow one another, but in that case, this succession is similar to that of the images on a cinematographic film. The film could be run off 10, 100, even 1,000 times faster, without the slightest modification in what was being shown. If its speed were increased to infinity, if the unrolling, this time away from the apparatus, became instantaneous, the pictures would still be the same. Succession, thus understood, therefore, adds nothing. On the contrary, it takes something away. It marks a deficit. It reveals a weakness in our perception, which is forced by this weakness to divide up the film image by image instead of grasping it in the aggregate. In short, time thus considered is no more than a space in idea where one imagines to be set out in line all past, present, and future events, and in addition, something which prevents them from appearing in a single perception. The unrolling in duration would be this very incompletion, the addition of a negative quantity. Such, consciously or unconsciously, is the thought of most philosophers, in accordance with the demands of the understanding, the necessities of language, and the symbolism of science. Not one of them has sought positive attributes in time. They treat succession as a coexistence which has failed to be achieved, and duration as a non-eternity. That is why, in spite of all their efforts, they cannot succeed in conceiving the radically new and unforeseeable. I speak not only of those philosophers who believe in so rigorous a concatenation of phenomena and events that effects must be deduced from causes. Such philosophers imagine that the future is given in the present, that it is theoretically visible in it, that to the present it will add nothing new. But even those few who have believed in free will have reduced it to a simple choice between two or more alternatives, as if these alternatives were possibles outlined beforehand, and as if the will was limited to bringing about one of them. They therefore still admit, even if they do not realize it, that everything is given. They seem to have no idea whatever of an act which might be entirely new, at least inwardly, and which in no way would exist, not even in the form of the purely possible, prior to its realization. But this is the very nature of a free act. To perceive it thus, as indeed we must do with any creation, novelty, or unpredictable occurrence whatsoever, we have to get back into pure duration. Try, for instance, to call up today the act you will accomplish tomorrow, even if you know what you are going to do. Your imagination perhaps evokes the movement to be gone through, but what you will think and feel in doing it, you can know nothing of today, because your state tomorrow will include all the life you will have lived up until that moment, with whatever that particular moment is to add to it. To fill this state in advance with what it should contain, you will need exactly the time which separates today from tomorrow, for you cannot shorten psychological life by a single instant without modifying its content. Can you shorten the length of a melody without altering its nature? The inner life is that very melody. In supposing, therefore, that you know what you will be doing tomorrow, you foresee only the external shape of your action. Any effort to imagine its interior beforehand will fill up a duration which, from one lengthening to another, will lead you to the moment when the action is accomplished and when there can no longer be any question of foreseeing it. What will it be if action is truly free, that is to say, created whole, in its outer design as well as in its inner coloring at that moment it is accomplished? Radical indeed is the difference between an evolution whose continuous phases penetrate one another by a kind of internal growth and an unfurling whose distinct parts are placed in juxtaposition to one another. The fan one spreads out might be opened with increased rapidity and even instantaneously. It would still display the same embroidery prefigured on the silk. But a real evolution, if it is ever accelerated or decelerated, is entirely modified within. Its acceleration or deceleration is precisely that internal modification. Its content and duration are one and the same thing. It is true that alongside the states of consciousness which live this unshrinkable and inextensible duration, there are material systems which time really glides over. Of the phenomena which follow from them, one can really say that they are the unfurling of a fan, or better still, the unrolling of a cinematographic film. Calculable ahead of time, they existed prior to their realization in the form of possibles. Such are the systems studied by astronomy, physics, and chemistry. Does the material universe in its entirety form a system of this kind? When our science assumes this, it simply means by so doing to discard everything in the universe which is not calculable. But the philosopher who does not want to discard anything is really obliged to ascertain that the states of our material world are contemporaneous with the history of our consciousness. As the latter endures, the former must be bound in some way to real duration. In theory, the film upon which the successive states of a wholly calculable system are pictured could be run off at any speed at all without changing a thing on it. In fact, this speed is fixed, since the unrolling of the film corresponds to a certain duration of our inner life, to that one and to no other. The film which is unrolling is therefore, in all probability, attached to consciousness which has duration and which regulates its movement. As we have said, when one wishes to prepare a glass of sugared water, one is obliged to wait until the sugar melts. This necessity for waiting is the significant fact. It shows that if one can cut out from the universe the systems for which time is only an abstraction, a relation, a number, the universe itself becomes something different. If we could grasp it in its entirety, inorganic but interwoven with organic beings, we should see it ceaselessly taking on forms as new, as original, as unforeseeable as our states of consciousness. But we have so much trouble in distinguishing between an evolution and an unfurling, between the radically new and a rearrangement of the pre-existing, in fact, between creation and simple choice, that this distinction cannot be clarified in too many directions at once. Let us say, then, that in duration, considered as a creative evolution, there is perpetual creation of possibility and not only of reality. Many will be loath to admit it because they will always believe that an event could not be accomplished if it had not been possible of accomplishment, so that before being real, it must have been possible. But look at it closely. You will see that possibility signifies two entirely different things, and that most of the time we waver between them, involuntarily playing upon the meaning of the word. When a musician composes a symphony, was his work possible before being real? Yes, if by this we mean that there was no insurmountable barrier to its realization. But from this completely negative sense of the word, we pass, inadvertently, to a positive sense. We imagine that everything which occurs could have been foreseen by any sufficiently informed mind, and that, in the form of an idea, it was thus pre-existent to its realization. An absurd conception in the case of a work of art, for from the moment that the musician has the precise and complete idea of the symphony he means to compose, his symphony is done. Neither in the artist's thought, nor, what is more, in any other thought comparable to ours, whether impersonal or even simply virtual, did the symphony exist in its quality of being possible before being real. But can we not say as much of any state of the universe whatsoever, taken with all conscious and living beings? Is it not richer in novelty, in the radical unforeseeable, than the symphony of even the greatest master? Nevertheless, the conviction still persists that even if it has not been conceived before being produced, it could have been, and in this sense from all eternity it has existed as possible in some real or virtual intelligence. The examining of this illusion should tell us that it results from the very essence of our understanding. Things and events happen at certain moments. The judgment which determines the occurrence of the thing or the event can only come after them. It therefore has its date. But this date at once fades away in virtue of the principle deep-rooted in our intellect that all truth is eternal. If the judgment is true now, it seems to us it must have always been so. It matters not that it had never yet been formulated. It existed by right before existing in fact. To every true affirmation, we attribute thus a retroactive effect, or rather, we impart to it a retrograde movement. As though a judgment could have pre-existed the terms which make it up, as though these terms did not date from the appearance of the objects they represent, as though the thing and the idea of the thing, its reality and its possibility, were not created at one stroke when a truly new form, invented by art or nature, is concerned. The consequences of this illusion are innumerable. Endnote 2. I explained at length my views on these consequences, and more generally on the belief in the retrospective value of true judgment and the retrograde movement of truth in lectures given at Columbia University, New York, in January and February 1913. I confine myself here to a few indications. Return to text. Our estimate of men and events is wholly impregnated with a belief in the retrospective value of true judgment, in a retrograde movement which truth, once posited, would automatically make in time. By the sole fact of being accomplished, reality casts its shadow behind it into the indefinitely distant past. It thus seems to have been pre-existent to its own realization, in the form of a possible. From this results an error which vitiates our conception of the past. From this arises our claim to anticipate the future on every occasion. We ask ourselves, for example, what the art, the literature, the civilization of tomorrow will be like. We picture approximately the graph of the evolution of societies. We go so far as to predict events in detail. We can always, to be sure, link up the reality once it is accomplished to the events which preceded it and to the circumstances in which it occurred. But taken from another angle, an entirely different reality, not just any reality, it is true, could just as well be linked up to the same circumstances and events. Are we to say then that by considering all sides of the present, extending it in every direction, we now should obtain all the possibles from which the future will choose, supposing it to have a choice? But in the first place, these prolongations themselves might be additions of new qualities, created from nothing and, as such, absolutely unforeseeable. And in the second place, a side of the present exists as a side only when our attention has isolated it, thus cutting a certain form out of the totality of present circumstances. How then could all the sides of the present exist before subsequent events have determined what forms the cuttings operated by our attention may have? These sides, it would seem, belong only in retrospect to a former present, that is to say, to the past, and they possessed no more reality in that present, when it was a present, than the symphonies of future musicians have reality in our own actual present. To take a simple example, nothing prevents us today from associating the romanticism of the 19th century with what was already romantic in the classical writers. But the romantic aspect of classicism is only brought by the retroactive effect of romanticism once it has appeared. If there had not been a Rousseau, a Chateaubriand, a Vigny, a Victor Hugo, not only should we never have perceived, but also there would never have really existed any romanticism in the earlier classical writers, for this romanticism of theirs only materializes by lifting out of their work a certain aspect, and this slice, with its particular form, no more existed in classical literature before romanticism appeared on the scene than there exists in the cloud floating by, the amusing design that an artist perceives in shaping to his fancy the amorphous mass. Romanticism worked retroactively on classicism as the artist's design worked on the cloud. Retroactively, it created its own prefiguration in the past and an explanation of itself by its predecessors. This amounts to saying that it is only by a lucky accident or exceptional good fortune that we can accurately note in the present reality what will be of most interest for the future historian. When that historian studies our present, he will be seeking in particular the explanation of his present, and more especially of what is new in his present. We today can have no idea whatsoever of this novelty if it is to be a creation. How then could we be guided by it in choosing from among the facts those we are to register, or rather in fabricating facts by arranging the present reality in the light of it? The essential fact of modern times is the advent of democracy. It is incontestably true that in the past, as described by its contemporaries, we find the shadows of coming events. But those indications which are perhaps most interesting would have been noted then only had they known that humanity was moving in that direction. Now the trend of that movement was at that time no more marked than any other, or rather it did not yet exist, since it was created by the movement itself, that is, by the forward march of the men who have progressively conceived and realized democracy. The premonitory signs are therefore, in our eyes, signs only because we now know the course, because the course has been completed. Neither the course, nor its direction, nor in consequence, its end were given when these facts came into being. Hence they were not yet signs. Let us go still further. We were saying that the most important facts in this connection could have been neglected by contemporaries. But the truth is that most of these facts did not yet exist as facts at that time. They would exist retrospectively for us if we could now resuscitate the period in its entirety, and play the particular form of searchlight we call the democratic idea over the solid block of reality as it was then. The portions thus illuminated, thus brought into relief from the whole, with contours as original and unforeseeable as the design of a great master, would be the preparatory facts of democracy. In short, in order to bequeath to our descendants the explanation, by its antecedents, of the essential event of their time, that event would already have to take shape before our eyes, and there would have to be no real duration. We transmit to future generations what interests us, what our attention centers upon, and even sketches, in the light of our past evolution, but not what the future will have made interesting to them by the creation of a new interest, by a new direction communicated to their attention. In other words, then, the historical origins of the present in its most important aspect cannot be completely elucidated, for they would only be restored in their completeness if it had been possible for the past to be expressed by its contemporaries in terms of an indeterminate and therefore unforeseeable future. Let us take a color such as orange. Endnote 3. The present study was written before my book, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, in which I have developed the same comparison. Return to text. As we also know red and yellow, we can consider orange as yellow in one sense, red in another, and say that it is composed of yellow and red. But suppose that, orange being what it is, neither yellow nor red had yet appeared in the world. Would orange still be composed of those two colors? Obviously not. The sensation of red and the sensation of yellow, involving as they do a whole nervous and cerebral mechanism at the same time as certain special dispositions of consciousness, are creations of life which have happened, but which could have not happened. And if there had never been, either on our planet or any other, beings undergoing these two sensations, the sensation of orange would have been a simple sensation. Never would the sensations of yellow and red have figured in it either as components or as aspects. I realize that our habitual logic protests. It says, if the sensations of yellow and red enter into the composition of the sensation of orange today, they entered into it always, even though there was a time when neither one of them existed effectively. They were there virtually. But that is because our ordinary logic is a logic of retrospection. It cannot help throwing present realities, reduced to possibilities or virtualities, back into the past so that what is compounded now must, in its eyes, always have been so. It does not admit that a simple state can, in remaining what it is, become a compound state solely because evolution will have created new viewpoints from which to consider it, and by so doing, created multiple elements in which to analyze it ideally. Our logic will not believe that if these elements had sprung forth as realities, they would not have existed before that as possibilities, the possibility of a thing never being, except where that thing is a purely mechanical arrangement of pre-existing elements, more than the mirage in the indefinite past of reality that has come into being. If this logic we are accustomed to pushes the reality that springs forth in the present back into the past in the form of a possible, it is precisely because it will not admit that anything does spring up, that something is created, and that time is efficacious. It sees in a new form or quality only a rearrangement of the old, nothing absolutely new. For it, all multiplicity resolves itself into a definite number of unities. It does not accept the idea of an indistinct and even undivided multiplicity, purely intensive or qualitative, which, while remaining what it is, will comprise an indefinitely increasing number of elements as the new points of view for considering it appear in the world. To be sure, it is not a question of giving up that logic or of revolting against it, but we must extend it, make it more supple, adapt it to a duration in which novelty is constantly springing forth and evolution is creative. The text breaks here into the next section. Such was the chosen course upon which I embarked. Many others opened up before me and around me from the center in which I had put myself in order to recapture pure duration. But I kept to that one because I had chosen, first of all, to try out my method on the problem of liberty. In so doing, I should be getting back into the flow of the inner life, of which philosophy seemed to me too often to retain only the hardened outer shell. Had not the novelist and moralist advanced farther in that direction than the philosopher? Perhaps, but it was only here and there, under the pressure of necessity, that they had broken through the barrier. No one had as yet bethought himself of setting out methodically in search of time gone by, à la recherche du temps perdu. Be that as it may, I gave only some bits of information on this subject in my first book, and still restricted myself to certain allusions in the second, when I compared the plane of action, wherein the past is contracted into the present, with the dream plane, where, indivisible and indestructible, the whole of the past is deployed. But if it is the province of literature to undertake in this way the study of the soul in the concrete upon individual examples, the duty of philosophy, it seemed to me, was to lay down the general conditions of the direct, immediate observation of oneself by oneself. This inner observation is warped by habits we've developed. The chief example of this warping is doubtless the one which created the problem of liberty, a pseudo-problem born of a confusion of duration with extension. But there are other pseudo-problems which seemed to have the same origin. Our moods appear to us as though they could be separated, counted so to speak. Certain of them, thus dissociated, have as it were an intensity which is measurable. For each and every one of these states, we think we can substitute the words which designate them, and which ever after will cover them up. We then attribute to them the fixity, the discontinuity, the generality of the words themselves. It is this covering that we must grasp in order to tear it off. But we shall grasp it only if we consider first its aspect and its structure, if, in addition, we understand its intended purpose. It is spatial by nature and has a social utility. Spatiality, therefore, and in this quite special sense, sociability, are in this case the real causes of the relativity of our knowledge. Brushing aside this veil, we get back to the immediate and reach an absolute. From these early reflections came conclusions which fortunately have become almost commonplace, but which, at the time, appeared daring. They required that psychology break with associationism, which was universally accepted, if not as a doctrine, at least as a method. They demanded still another break, which at that time I only half saw. Beside associationism, there was Kantianism, whose influence, often combined with that of the former, was no less powerful and widespread. Those who repudiated the positivism of a Comte or the agnosticism of a Spencer dared not to go so far as to question the Kantian conception of the relativity of knowledge. Kant had proved, so it was said, that our thought exerts itself upon a matter previously scattered in space and time, and thus prepared especially for man. The thing in itself escapes us. To comprehend it, we would need an intuitive faculty which we do not possess. On the contrary, from my analysis, the result was that at least a part of reality, our person, can be grasped in its natural purity. Here, at any rate, the materials of our knowledge have not been created, or ground out of shape and reduced to power, by some malicious genius who has afterwards thrown into some artificial receptacle, such as our consciousness, a psychological dust. Our person appears to us just as it is in itself, as soon as we free ourselves of the habits contracted for our greater convenience. But might it not be the same for other realities, perhaps even for all of them? Was the relativity of consciousness, which arrested the soaring of metaphysics, original and essential? Or rather, might it not be accidental and acquired? Would it not simply be due to the fact that the intelligence has contracted habits necessary for everyday living? These habits, transferred to the domain of speculation, bring us face to face with a reality, distorted or made over, or at any rate, arranged. But the arrangement does not force itself upon us irresistibly. It comes from ourselves. What we have done we can undo, and we enter then into direct contact with reality. It was therefore not only a psychological theory, associationism, which I brushed aside. It was also, and for a similar reason, a general philosophy such as Kantianism and everything connected with it. Both of them, almost universally accepted at that time in their main outlines, appeared to me as impedimenta, hindering philosophy and psychology from going ahead. The only thing to do, then, was to go ahead. It was not enough to brush aside the obstacle. As a matter of fact, I undertook the study of psychological functions, then of psychophysiological relation, then of life in general, always seeking direct vision, and in this way suppressing problems which did not concern the things themselves, but their translation into artificial concepts. I shall not stop here to go into something which would only show the extreme complication of a method to all appearance so simple. I shall speak of it again very briefly in the next chapter. But since I began by saying that my primary concern was precision, let me end by pointing out that precision could not have been obtained, as I see it, by any other method. For lack of precision is commonly the including of a thing in too wide a genus, things and genera corresponding moreover to pre-existing words. But if one begins by casting off ready-made concepts, if one professes to have a direct vision of reality, if one subdivides this reality taking into account its articulations, the new concepts one must form in order to express oneself will now be cut to the exact measure of the object. Lack of precision will arise only from the extension of these concepts to other objects which they would include equally in their generality, but which will have to be studied in themselves, outside of these concepts, when one wishes to know them in their turn.